This episode of Engineering the Future is brought to you by Member Perks for OSPI, helping engineers and their families save money on everything from electronics and food to apparel and home improvements. New perks are being added all the time. Visit Member Perks for OSPI before you shop and enjoy exclusive savings from brand names and local favorites online, curbside, and in-store.
This podcast is brought to you by OSPI, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, the advocacy body for professional engineers and the engineering community in Ontario.
In this special episode of Engineering the Future, I speak with representatives from both the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies Ontario and the Ontario Association of Architects. OSPI is working alongside these organizations to urge the Ontario government to adopt qualification-based selection as a best practice. By adopting QBS, engineering firms will be chosen based on their credentials rather than simply the lowest bid. QBS is known to be a competitive and fair process that selects firms that are best qualified for each individual project. I hope you enjoy this very important conversation. Welcome to Engineering the Future, a podcast presented by the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. I am your host, Jerome James. Today, I'm joined by Bruce Matthews, a professional engineer, OSPI member, and executive director of the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies Ontario. Bruce's association experience includes deputy registrar postings at Professional Engineers Ontario, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, and the Ontario College of Trades. Thank you so much for joining me today, Bruce.
Thanks, Jerome. Glad to be here.
Great. So to start off, for those who aren't familiar with ACEC-Ontario, can you tell us a little bit about the organization and its mandate?
Sure thing. ACEC-Ontario is the industry association for firms that offer engineering services and expertise to arm's length clients. The association was founded in 1975, and we promote and advance the business interests of our member firms and the value of the engineering work they do. Where OSPI serves the interests of individual engineers, be they employed by a manufacturer or by government or even by one of our firms, we serve the business interests of engineering companies. Our member firms serve clients in both the public and private sector, finding innovative solutions to technical problems and providing strategic advice. ACEC-Ontario supports the success of our member firms through our leadership in policy advocacy and risk management, and we also provide access to key knowledge-sharing networks and relevant support services. At present, ACEC-Ontario represents approximately 140 consulting engineering firms that employ nearly 21,000 people in Ontario. Our member firms range in size from sole proprietorships through to large multinational organizations.
Very interesting. That's quite a long history that ACEC-Ontario has. Can you tell us about some examples of ACEC-Ontario and OSPI working together in the past?
Sure. We consider OSPI to be an important association partner of ACEC-Ontario. There's a significant overlap in our respective interests. We both deeply care about the profession. We both believe engineering is an excellent career and that professional engineers make vital contributions to the societal, economic, and environmental well-being of Ontario. Both organizations are part of the Construction and Design Alliance of Ontario, CDAO, which together with some other design and construction industry associations is a forum for discussion, development, and advocacy of the industry's issues related to provincial government policy, legislation, and/or regulation. ACEC and Ontario and OSPI have supported each other in many ways over the years. Back in 2018, the relationship was actually formalized through a memorandum of understanding that provides for mutual information sharing, collaboration, and support, including joint advocacy efforts. And one example of that is our joint effort to get PEO, the regulator, focused on its regulatory mandate.
Oh, excellent. I'm very supportive of that mandate and the work that you guys have been doing. And it's great to see that the two organizations have been able to get along so well over the years. So let's get right down to the meat of our discussion today. For those who don't know, could you explain a little bit more about what qualifications-based selection is and why is it so important for engineering today?
Sure thing. QBS is an approach to the procurement of engineering services. It's driven by an overarching philosophy that engineering services should be procured on the basis of demonstrated competence and qualifications for the needed services, and that contracts should be negotiated based on fair and reasonable terms and prices. By contrast, what happens all too often today is that procurement for engineering services is done on a low price basis. And while some jurisdictions do include a technical evaluation component along with price, it's been our experience that the technical evaluations are insensitive, that they don't provide meaningful differentiation among the proponent engineering firms, and therefore selection ultimately comes down to price. And this is bad for the engineering firms and it's bad for the client. Low price selection commoditizes engineering services. It devalues the knowledge and skill and judgment that professional engineers bring to the table when those services are procured in the same way as a municipality might be procuring paper clips or road salt. So when price rules the day, it sort of creates this race to the bottom for engineering firms, and that's not good for anyone.
What is some worst case scenarios that can happen with the way the status quo of procurement is right now?
Well, what low price bidding does is it encourages a minimalist interpretation of the client's requirements, so that you're going to put in the necessary resources and or the skill set of individuals dedicated to the project will sort of be at that absolute lowest limit because you want to be able to put in a price that's going to get you the business. And of course, everyone knows you're driving toward that aspect of price selection. If you go in, what you know is going to be too high, or even frankly, what you think the job ought to require, but because of the way that the RFP has been described, you put in a direct response, but at a very minimalist interpretation. An uncommon concern that's expressed, of course, during the course of an execution of a project is, changes in design spec because of information that wasn't available at the time that the proposal was developed. The scoping was basically wrong, or that there are extra time requirements because the underlying requirements were perfectly understood because they weren't documented and everyone was driving for price.
Right. Okay. It's clear that something needs to change. Can you describe some of the processes and parameters that will be improved, say, if QBS is adopted widely?
Sure. I mean, we view QBS as, first of all, it's a competitive process and it's a transparent process, but we see it as a win-win for the client and for the engineering firm. I'd say the primary benefit, of course, through a QBS process is to the client. And of course, where the client is the municipal or is a provincial government or a municipality or an agency of the some sort of the public sector, then ultimately that process benefits the public. And it can benefit them either as the users of a piece of infrastructure that's being developed, or frankly, simply as taxpayers, because there are ultimately resultant flow-through benefits to using QBS that will result in lower life cycle cost for the owner of the particular asset.
Very interesting. So ACEC-Ontario, OSPE, and the Association of Architects have been working together to advocate on QBS. Why does it make sense that engineers and architects alike should be pushing this issue on this united front, as it were?
Sure. Well, all three organizations know that the impact that design can have on the life cycle value of a project. Changes that might cost $100 to make during the design phase can easily cost $1,000 during construction and $10,000 if you wait until you're up and running and doing it during operation and maintenance. That's the life cycle impact that I've mentioned earlier. QBS minimizes cost growth during a project. And in addition, there's research that we're undertaking through CDAO, that organization I mentioned earlier, the Construction and Design Alliance of Ontario, and that's showing the positive impact that upfront investment in design can actually have on project delivery efficiency. And QBS is really the best means of leveraging that upfront investment because it results in better scoping for the projects and hence better informed design. Now, as I noted before, the principal benefit to QBS is to the client, and I'd like to assume that the Government of Ontario and our municipalities all want the best value for the infrastructure investments that they're going to be making as we come out of the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And procuring design services through QBS puts the focus on that best life cycle value for the infrastructure asset. It's still competitive and transparent, as I mentioned before, but it's a process that should survive political scrutiny.
So it is good for the client. It's good for the members involved, both parties involved, and it's good for the engineers involved getting a fair price for their expertise. It seems
Absolutely.
like a win-win all around.
Well, it is, and in the U.S., if I may, Jerome, in the United States, the federal government has been required by law to procure engineering and architecture services through a QBS process since 1972.
Wow.
And that same requirement is actually true for about 90% of the state governments and countless numbers of municipalities in the U.S. So ACEC-Ontario, OSPE, and the OAA, we would like to see similar legislation in Ontario applicable to government ministries, government agencies, and municipalities, requiring them to use a QBS process for procurement of engineering and architecture services.
So what would you say is the main barrier for widespread adoption of this policy?
I believe the concern is frankly political in nature, and that the people in the sort of decision-making realms have a hard time getting their head around the idea that they're simply not buying the cheapest product out there. That they're not, they equate low price to best value, and that's the big problem. The two things are not equal in any way, shape, or form.
Because they believe that there's some supernatural level playing field, that everything is equal off the bat.
Well, precisely. That's right. It treats, one engineering firm is just as good as any other. And, we represent engineering companies, and I can tell you, everyone's got their own flavor. Everyone's got their own skill set and competencies. There's probably a small number that are perfect for any particular procurement in a particular project, and those are the ones who you would use in the course of a QBS to sort of shortlist and then work through a more detailed scoping. I'm not going to get into the details of the actual QBS process, but the idea here is that you don't want to be trading off your life cycle value for short-term savings during design.
Right.
The old joke used to be, and I used to be in the consulting game for many years, right, is that, you can have it fast, you can have it cheap, or you can have it good. Pick two. You can never have all three, right? If you want it cheap and fast, it's not going to be very good. If you want it good and cheap, well, you're going to have to wait. And if you want it good and fast, it's going to cost you. So right. I think, frankly, QBS provides a nice balance of the three, because those are always the struggles that, public sector procurement organizations are dealing with. They want to deal with those kind of things. But I think with that proper focus on life cycle value, realizing, we're talking for infrastructure assets, things are going to be in place for decades and be operated and maintained. And those things that the designers can do when they properly understand a project, when it's properly scoped out, that can save a fortune during operation and maintenance for most of those decades. And sure, it's going to cost you just a little bit more during the design phase, but it's a well worth it trade-off. But it's really hard when there are the political forces at play, where the sight lines of politicians are to the next election. So, why they would have to be able to rationalize and justify what they did in awarding contract to not a lowest price circumstance, are they concerned it's not going to get them reelected? Whereas they really should be focusing on the fact that we got you the best life cycle value out of this asset that we bought, out of this bridge, out of this road, out of this hospital, and so on.
Great, great. So I want to ask, is there any model or jurisdiction that is currently out there that has adopted QBS to a certain extent that we can point to saying like this is a success story, that it actually works, that we can move in the direction of QBS in Canada?
Sure, and that's the important thing. On this side of the border, there are a few, not a lot. Again, we'd like to see much more adoption, but I would say the shining star is the city of Calgary. They have wholeheartedly embraced QBS for the procurement of engineering services and architectural services, I believe. So they're sort of our go-to when any other municipality is making inquiries about it. We say, here's the folks to talk to over in Calgary. They really know what they're doing. The City of London has, and it's sort of come and gone, but they've been a fairly good supporters of the concept, not using it 100% as broadly as perhaps we'd like, but they have been proponents of QBS as an approach. And there's a few others that have done some initial pilot projects that are still sort of experimenting and trying to see what it's really like. The City of Waterloo did one a couple of years back, and I know within the last, 2 years as well, at the federal level, I'm trying to remember which particular federal department it was. I want to say it may be Fisheries and Oceans, but I could be wrong. But had a couple of projects here in Ontario where they wanted to use QBS as their mechanisms of procurement. And from what I understand, those things went very, very well. So hopefully we'll start to see more of it in the future. And one thing I will let your listeners know about is our national level organization, ACEC Canada, maintains a website called Yes to QBS. That's YES, number 2, QBS.com. Has a lot of great information about the QBS process and has links to various supporting material about QBS as a procurement process.
And on that point, I know that sole sourcing is a big problem in the procurement game. It's used as an excuse sometimes to avoid having to entertain low quality bids. Is QBS a way to reduce this problem and reintroduce the bidding process as it was intended?
Well, there's the key word. You're right. I mean, any sole sourcing of contracts puts a very bitter taste in the taxpayer's mouth because, again, there seems to be no control. The company seems to be able to set its own price and so on. So how do you know that you're actually getting a fair and reasonable price and fair and reasonable terms in that particular contract? Now, a lot of municipalities have what they call roster work for certain sort of not terribly technical aspects of either build or maintenance of roads and bridges and so on. And what some of those jurisdictions will do is identify a pool of firms who have been pre-qualified and then just kind of rotate amongst them in terms of whatever the next process is or whatever the next contract is.
Right.
And that's a fair enough process. What we would recommend, of course, is that the roster be defined through a QBS process so that you know that you're getting the best qualified and competent firms and that all the terms have been negotiated on a fair and reasonable basis. And it really is those are the stress words that I like to use when we talk about QBS. It's sometimes a challenge because we're the service provider trying to push this as a mechanisms and people might look at that suspiciously thinking, well, why do they want to do it this way? What's it must not be good for us if it's being pushed by the people that we're trying to contract with. But again, as I've said so much earlier, this is a win-win situation. And ultimately, go back to that overarching philosophy is that you want to ensure you're getting the best qualified people in terms of their competency and experience, and you want to ensure that you're getting things at fair and reasonable terms and prices. And I've never encountered anyone on a procurement side who says they're not interested in fair and reasonable terms and prices. Nobody's going to go on record saying, well, no, I want this to be unfair or unreasonable, right? It doesn't happen. So if we keep stressing that QBS is what results in a fair and reasonable result in terms of procuring engineering services, then hopefully we'll get more uptake that way.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for enlightening us on this topic and bringing that engineer's perspective.
My pleasure.
And in wrapping up, I would love for you to explain to our listening audience why you are a dedicated OSPE member.
Oh, sure. Well, I've been an OSPE member since day one. And in fact, I was working at PEO, at Professional Engineers Ontario, on the day that OSPE was born. Frankly, at a philosophical level, I'm a strong believer in the separation of church and state. I think the engineering profession needs a strong and focused regulator, and it needs a strong and focused advocacy and member service organization. One organization can't succeed trying to do both of those jobs. So OSPE is the important voice that engineers have to convey and protect their interests. And frankly, in addition, the affinity programs that OSPE offers are second to none. I've got both my car and home insurance covered through OSPE's program with the personal, and the rates can't be beat. I do shop it around every couple of years just to be sure, and no one comes close, including some other affinity programs that I have access to. So they're number one. But it's that advocacy and representation that are the most important functions of OSPE, and those things can't happen, obviously, unless you've got dues-paying members. So I gladly, pay my dues every year because I know the great work that OSPE is doing.
And that's the tagline, that we have the cheapest rates for home and auto insurance. So I'm glad you're keeping us honest and making those comparisons every couple of years.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Bruce. Thank you for enlightening us with your knowledge on the topic of QBS. Bruce Matthews is a professional engineer, OSPE member, and executive director of ACEC-Ontario.
We hope you're enjoying this episode so far. At OSPE, we're here for you, making sure government, media, and the public are listening to the voice of engineers. You can learn more at ospe.on.ca.
Today I'm joined with representatives from the Ontario Association of Architects, or OAA, the regulatory body for architects in the province of Ontario. Kristi Doyle is the executive director, and Adam Tracey is the manager of policy and government relations. Thank you both for joining me today.
Glad
Thanks
to be
for having
here.
us.
I'm going to start with you, Kristi. Can you tell me more about the OAA and its mandate?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Jerome. I have to say the OAA is certainly an organization of considerable history and longevity. We were established in 1889. The Ontario Association of Architects, as you said, is a provincial regulator. We're similar to other organizations that are established to regulate the various professions in Ontario. So, of course, as you said, we are the regulator for architecture. We're similar to organizations like PEO, the Law Society of Ontario, College of Teachers, Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. So the principal object of the association is to regulate the practice of architecture and to govern its members in accordance with the public interest so that interest can be served and protected. And this includes our members, which are architects, and also licensed technologists, OAA. So if I had to put it directly, our primary mandate is to serve and protect the public interest. And so the OAA fulfills the mandate to protect and serve the public interest in a number of ways, and we do this through making sure that those licensed to practice architecture in Ontario are competent to do so. We determine professional standards of conduct and competency that are required from our members, and we take steps to ensure that they're compliant with that. We establish and oversee a process for determining when a member may have breached their professional obligations, and if so, we set consequences for that. We prevent illegal and unauthorized practice of architecture.
Right.
And if I could just add, having said that, for the purposes of carrying out our primary mandate, we also have sort of what we call secondary objects, and that really revolves around things like assisting in the establishment and maintenance of classes, schools of architecture, exhibitions, lectures, and all of this is really in the realm of promoting the public appreciation for architecture and for the profession. And so the OAA also provides a range of regulatory and outreach programs to assist members of the public, also our own members and other stakeholders. And finally, if I could say, in order to help us fulfill this mandate and our public interest obligation, we work with other regulators, we work with provincial and federal government. Mm-hmm. We also work with national, international organizations, architectural organizations that are on matters of, I'd say, professional practice, mutual recognition of license, and also just best practices for regulators and regulatory organizations.
Great. So in light, you are essentially what PEO is to engineers for architecture.
Yes.
Interesting. So I want to throw it over to Adam right now. I'm understanding that the OAA and OSPI have worked together in the past. Could you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, I'll defer some of that to Kristi because she's got a much longer history with me. But I will say I've had the pleasure of working with OSPI through sitting, with Kristi and also our elected councillors at the Construction Design Alliance of Ontario. I've been there since I started at the OA since 2013, and the relationship has always been great. For me, being the manager of policy and government relations, I tend to be down in that rabbit hole. So I'm working with GR and policy staff at OSPI, really on a number of files, coordinating collective industry responses to the budget, recommendations around infrastructure, all kinds of things like that. So it's been great for me to have somebody to plug in the industry and broaden our own perspectives. I think we never want to get too pigeonholed and just focusing on architectural issues. But again, a very long history of stuff going back, and I would turn it over to Kristi there.
Yeah, sure. If you want to add to that, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And if I could talk about just a couple of initiatives, and really, I guess the main way we work with OSPI and also a lot of our allied partners is through the CDAO, as Adam mentioned. And so, for example, over the past year, we've been very actively involved in addressing in a collective way how to navigate our way through COVID pandemic, how to react to government directives, safety protocols, just trying to keep the design and construction industry moving so that we can get the much needed public infrastructure designed and built. And so just to add that, over the years, there's other ways, while maybe not overtly obvious, but we often will connect with OSPI on issues of mutual concern and interest. So, we appreciate that relationship, and there's a lot of strength in being able to collaborate, leverage each other's ideas, programs, services, bounce ideas off each other. So we certainly appreciate the positive relationship that we've had with OSPI over the years.
Great. It sounds like a really great relationship that has been fostered over the years, and hopefully it continues into the future. Mm-hmm. But I would love to get right into the meat of the conversation today, of what we want to talk about, which is associated with qualifications-based selection, and or QBS for short. Can you elaborate on what exactly QBS is, and why are architects and engineers alike pushing for its implementation?
And Jerome, I'll defer to Adam. Adam's our resident expert. This is his file. He works a lot with QBS, so I'll defer to Adam, and he can take that one.
For sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much time do you have? I sent my notes over to Kristi. I think she was a little bit mortified. I said, well, I'll work on trimming it down, but it has been a file. I inherited it I think the day I joined the OA. It was one of the things that Kristi handed over to me. And I've got a bit of a background in procurement when I worked in the federal government as well, not on quality-based selection or qualifications-based selection, but procurement generally. So it was an interesting segue for me. So I refer to it as QBS. I already made the slip up of quality-based selection. Originally, that was what we were calling it. We've come to terms with syncing up with the engineers and the rest of the world that calls it qualifications-based selection. But really what it's about is about quality. And it's a focus on not on lowest price or even price and fairness. It's a focus on innovation and getting the best out of your procurement process. So I'll get to that a little bit more because there's a couple important points in there, but it's not to say that price isn't a consideration. It's just not the driving consideration. So we're really behind a lot of other jurisdictions here. The U.S. is obviously a big one. They've passed the Brooks Act back in 1973. So we're talking 50 years of history using QBS. It's actually illegal to hire consultants based on lowest fee in the United States and has been for a very long time.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. I feel like that's going to be news to a lot of listeners that is actually a thing in the States.
It was news to me when I learned it, and it's always stuck in my head. If it wasn't successful, you wouldn't have seen what happened next, which was a broader adoption across almost all of the states and territories in the United States, and even some of the municipalities too. So it exists south of the border. If we think that this is the way that everybody does procurement, it's not. This is really a Canadian-centric approach to procurement that isn't a standard thing.
Wow.
The other interesting points, it's used in Canada. The Quebec government has mandated it for some of their procurement processes. Other municipalities use it or a form of QBS. It was used in London, Ontario, and Edmonton, and different places. I think there's a couple municipalities out in BC. So it's not even necessarily a standard practice in Canada to focus on lowest value or best value procurement. It's being recommended by the federal government. They put out an info guide saying QBS is the way to hire consultants. So that should be of note to architects and engineers. There's a great document, an info guide put out by the federal government and National Research Council. The House of Commons Standing Committee recommended the adoption of QBS. The list goes on and on and on.
Oh, nice.
And we've just sort of refused to get with the times, I would say. So
does that mean that government procurement practices have reflected that QBS model and in the bids that they go out for tenure for?
In Canada or in Ontario, certainly not. It is by far the exception.
Right.
We've got some research underway, and it was difficult to even to drum up some examples for it. But they do exist. They're just few and far between, and we're really actively working to try and change that because it's really about choosing the best consultant for the job.
Right.
And if that's the fundamentals of it, I don't know who would ever be opposed to that as an idea, including the procurement community. You know, nobody wants somebody who isn't qualified or isn't the best fit, doesn't have the knowledge that they need to deliver on the project. So it's a good procurement process for architects and engineers, but for procurement officials, for government officials, and for the general public. If I have the time to share it, along the way, I've had a lot of conversations about QBS and some really great, real life examples and some great hypothetical examples. The one hypothetical that always stuck out to me was, imagine a scenario where an architect, let's say they've worked on this on a specific site before, so they know this site and they know the project inside and out. They know that something to do with the site conditions is going to be a problem moving forward, in the design and the construction phase. The dilemma that consultant would have is if they add the necessary changes or innovation, whatever it might be, to make sure that project is the best project and addresses those concerns, that's going to drive up the price of their bid. They're almost guaranteed to lose that project.
Wow.
If they don't put it in, they might win it. But they know in doing that what's going to come out of it, obviously, is a lot of delays, change orders, driving up costs, and problems, a lot of headaches for everybody. That's the kind of procurement system that we have built right now and that we're operating on. It can actually work to disadvantage the most qualified architects, engineers, and frankly, consultants generally. The more you know, sometimes the worse it can actually be for you.
That's horrendous. So you guys are working to raise awareness and push this forward for adoption widely. Have you guys been involved in pilot projects, showcase projects to raise that awareness? And how have you been involved with that?
Yeah, so we have, and we've had some success. We always talk about, in the government relations world, the policy too, it's a long game. Some of this stuff, it's 10, 20 years. So you never expect things to change, immediately overnight. But we have been really, really encouraged to see quite a lot of change, certainly in the last couple of years too. So as a segue to that, I want to talk about what QBS isn't. That was one of the big hurdles we had to address. And QBS is not this mixed model. We get it even from our members who work in the public sector saying, we use QBS. It's great. We've been using it for a long time. We only have 30% focused on price and 70% is focused on technical qualifications. Unfortunately, that's not QBS. QBS, you need to just have 100% of the initial assessment on technical qualifications. That's really it at the end of the day. The second that you introduce even a threshold of 10%, you drive your consultants to value, maybe a misnomer here, but value engineer the project. What can they strip out of it? They don't want to be innovative. They don't want to rock the boat because, again, all of those things could work against them actually winning the procurement. And it's not a blank check, though. It doesn't eliminate the consideration of price. You have that initial assessment. You pick your preferred proponent to that. You negotiate the scope. You figure out what the project actually is and is about. And then you discuss price. If a procurement official decides the price is too high, there's absolutely nothing in the QBS model that stops them from going on to the second or the third or the fourth person. So really, we had to break some of those barriers down and up the level of understanding about QBS to start to see the adoption that we've had now. And it's been really positive. So the first crack in that wall, I would say, came from a great partner, which was the federal government. We had a number of meetings years ago. It was again another partner at the table, ACEC-Ontario and federally, and actually somebody from down in the States came as well to really deliver a cross-platform presentation to the federal government, architects and engineers standing together and talking about why QBS was great. And in that conversation, we had sort of one of those textbook responses. It always stuck with me, saying, if I give my kids, I can appreciate it. I've got kids myself. If I give them $100, my kids will all figure out exactly how to spend $100. And the correction in that conversation was, that's not what's happening here. Absolutely. There is $100 only, and all of your kids have to figure out and present and pitch to you the best way to spend that $100. And only the best use is going to get the 100. And you can kind of see the ripple through the room. And at the head of the table, the ADM of procurement said, what's stopping us from doing this? And there was a real knee-jerk reaction from the procurement officials. And she said, no, it's time to get on with this. Let's try QBS. So there's been a QBS pilot happening at the federal government for a number of years now. It's slow going. It's the analogy of turning the boat. It doesn't move fast. But we've just been in conversations again with PSPC. They're still committed. They're rolling out more projects this year. They're bigger and more sophisticated projects. So that's going to generate more data and more findings for them. I think really help to spur it along. We've got a huge public sector client we've been working with. I guess, COVID makes it hard to track time. I think now we're probably coming up at a year and a half. It's a huge portfolio. I wouldn't necessarily say it's true QBS, but it is abandoning lowest bid in their procurement process. And they're very encouraged. They've got the buy-in of the board. This is a big public sector client. So we're really interested to see that come out. And I think that'll come out sometime soon. These have been the big wins, I would say, in terms of the adoption and the pilots. But we continue to look for new partners. We really had to kind of strategize with that. We've generated the research. We've got the findings. We've got literature reviews. It's very well established. People know the benefits of QBS. I think we've actually come to that point where the procurement community doesn't want to hear anymore about why QBS is good. They want to know how QBS can be done. And so we've shifted our conversations to that. So I may regret it, but I would say to any procurement officials on the call, I sit there and our practice advisors, I'll volunteer, our time, but we're willing to sit and really roll up our sleeves and work with you directly to figure out how to roll QBS out so we can get a broader adoption, whether that's a pilot or whether that's just, fully adopted, accept that it's a best practice. It's very long established, but, we're there to work with you.
For sure. And I could see the engineering community buy in wholeheartedly on this idea because, what is one of the first places to cut costs? Wages. And it bastardizes and reduces the need for quality people. They're always looking for the lowest bidder, and it keeps people from going after their P.Engs because they think that they're going to be priced out of work. And we want to promote engineering as a profession to have people progress and take pride in the profession that they've chosen. And if everyone is treated like a dime a dozen, it doesn't really bring in that quality perspective and that innovative perspective either to the mix. So I can see this being very popular once people get more notification about it. And it seems that it has to be wide adoption, else people can slither through the cracks. Is that not the idea, that someone has to blink first, as it were, and everyone will follow suit afterwards? Or is there another way that you think it should be mandated from on high? Kristi, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, certainly if it were mandated, if there was something that comes from the top down around a policy statement, just a general cultural shift or policy shift from the top down that was mandated, that would be ideal. Whether or not we get there, I don't know. I think one of the things that Adam spoke about, how I think we think there's an understanding now about the value of this, but what they're often bumping up against is that rationale or something to demonstrate why it is actually at the end of the day getting the better team, getting the quality team, getting the right team for the job is the right way to go, even if. Because, I'll cut to the chase. I mean, taxpayers are looking at how public monies are being spent. And so they're saying, well, why did you spend more than you needed to if this wasn't the lowest price? So helping demonstrate that what the value of the qualifications-based selection is really important. And, if I could just add, one of the things that's happening through the OAA and at the national level, we're working with our counterparts on a national architecture policy that when you might think of it, well, what is that? But it's really about, it's got many facets, but one of them is about raising the awareness and understanding from a public's perspective about the value of good design and what that means at the end of the day. And so, what in practical terms, what we hope would happen is once there's a better understanding, is in fact the public would demand qualifications-based selection. They want the best product. They want the best built environment because that's what they're living, playing, working in. So yeah, that's, I guess, the other way of looking at it is that it would be great if we were at a point where the public actually said, we want the best quality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a great initiative and something that I believe that the OAA and OSPE alike are very passionate about. What other public policy industry-wide changes does the OAA advocate for?
Well, I guess the first thing I'll say, Jerome, is we don't advocate in the traditional sense. We're the regulator.
Right.
When we say if we use the word advocate, we're advocating for the public good, for the public interest. So, that's kind of the way we look at it. But I guess, if I could add a couple things, obviously climate stability is of great concern. I know that's concern. I've had conversations through CDAO with my counterpart with Sandro about some of the initiatives and some of the submissions that we made to government about restarting the design and construction industry as part of the COVID restart, and just how public money is being spent on infrastructure, and how there's a real opportunity to infuse into that principles, innovation around innovative design that will help address the climate stability. I think we're kind of past talking about sustainability now and sustainable design. We have to move to climate stability, because I think that's where we're at now. So, that's a good example of how we're also infusing into the conversations that we have, because at the end of the day, that's the public interest. We've got to address that, and I think it's something that we have to address collectively. Architects, engineers, they're trained to be problem solvers, to be innovative designers, and to the core tenet of their licensure as professionals is the public interest.
Do you think that that's like a point that engineers and architects should band together on and move forward for the common good, for climate into the future?
Well, I'd like to think that we have those discussions are happening. I would say it's probably a bigger industry discussion through the Construction and Design Alliance, and some of the conversations that we've had, and some of the initiatives or the papers, the policy papers that we have advanced. But I think there's lots of work to be done. There's education, there's resources, there's tools. I mean, we can't. Our role as the OAA is to make sure our members have the competencies and are well equipped to address this challenge. And so we're focused on tools, resources, education. That's also somewhere that we could certainly work together.
Excellent. Adam, did you want to add anything to that?
I did. It was in our original notes and it got scrubbed, but I'm gonna bring it back out of the ashes, I think, because I don't want to talk about the bill itself, but I want to talk about, the story of the bill. And it was the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act, which was passed by the former government. And to me, that was a really crystallizing moment, because you had the Minister of Infrastructure stand up and say that they wanted to bring back a golden age of infrastructure, infrastructure design and construction and development. And the way they saw that happening was by architects and engineers working together. And it's on the Hansard. Architecture doesn't always get a lot of mentions at Queen's Park, but it's there. It was a whole bill about these two professions working together to solve some of these major crises that we're facing, and to bring forward innovative solutions that really can be best unlocked by the two professions working together. So, that has always stood out in me. I think, in my office, I haven't been there in a while, but I think it's probably actually printed out and pinned up on my wall somewhere, because I look back at that quite often. I think that that really is our way moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And because it's very topical, everyone's dealing with it. How has COVID changed the regulatory landscape of architecture, or has it? Either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll jump in, Jerome. I guess, I'm not sure it's changed the regulatory landscape, because it is what it is, right? We have an Architects Act regulations there under, and so what has happened is a shift in the way some practices are operating, whether it be around general review, whether it be around remote supervision, whether it be around remote submissions. I think that's probably true across the board for many professions. It's just things are happening remotely. So, certainly there's been a lot of shifting. I think what has happened too is it's actually moved the bar. There's some things that perhaps we've talked about or we've thought about into the future, and maybe there's something that we were thinking 5 years out, but it's actually forced us to think about things and or make changes and shift in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. So there's certainly some things for our practices that are shifting, are different. And again, I think that what's happened too is it's not that it'll necessarily go back to the way that it was before. There's probably more opportunities now. There's more, it's a hybrid type model of certain things. We've tried to keep our members constantly abreast of what's happening in terms of the COVID government protocols and directives through our website, and then also given them tips about things to look for and things to be aware of it now that the landscape has changed somewhat.
Great. That sounds like the OAA is very proactive on that file. I really want to thank both of you for coming today and speaking on these topics. I feel like we had a really great discussion, and good luck in making the QBS something that is prolific in Ontario and then subsequently in Canada. Today we've been talking to Kristi Doyle, the Executive Director, and Adam Tracey is the Manager of Policy and Government Relations at the Ontario Architects Association.
From all of us at OSPI, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, thanks for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.